Hey everyone, Wolf Lord Rho here. Today we continue our discussion on Magnus the Red with his opinion of each and every brother Primarch. A general spoiler warning to begin, as today we will be referencing events from across the Warhammer 40k universe, and in particular the Horus Heresy. So you have been warned, and with that said, let's just jump straight in. Okay, so in part 1, we covered Magnus's opinion of the first half of the Primarchs, starting with Lionel Johnson, through to the 10th Primarch, the Gorgon Ferrus Manus. If you missed it, definitely go back and give that a listen to see those Primarchs before continuing on with this. Now, as always, this is just my opinion and interpretation of the events we see in the lore. And I am only human, so there of course may be moments I've missed or forgotten, but I always try my best to check as much as I can. And I'm going by moments specifically within the novels, not any other more vague references that may be out there. But okay, without further ado, let's just jump straight in with our next Primarch, Angron. Maybe unsurprisingly, there isn't much in regards to Magnus and Angron's relationship. However, we did receive a fantastically revealing comment by Magnus in regards to Angron within the Siege of Terror novel Fury of Magnus. I always used to mock Angron for his loss of control, his bestial rages. But when I saw what I had done, I knew I was no better than him. Now, Magnus is talking about his ruining of the Emperor's Webway project here. But what a passage in regards to Angron it is. Really revealing how Magnus looked down on him. That he mocked him. Privately and behind his back, I've got no doubt, but that he believed him to be weak as well. Most likely in relation to his rage, seeing it as not resisting the butcher's nails, bowing to the easy option. And that doesn't surprise me with Magnus at all. He could be very arrogant and pompous when he wanted to be, which was pretty often. Seeing himself as better, above others. The Magnus I know would have looked down on Angron. Sure, he would have been polite in person, most likely a bit lecturing, but it's clear they wouldn't have had much interaction outside of the mandatory at all. Moving on, next we have Roboute Guilliman. Now, in some aspects you can see some similarities between Magnus and Roboute. Both of them valuing education of their people. Both of them caring about humanity. Both at the time of the Great Crusade devoted to the Emperor. And from the current 40k era, the Dark Imperium trilogy, we can clearly see the impression of how much Roboute respected Magnus's power, perhaps even feared. And I think that also highlighted the difference between them. Magnus the ethereal, Roboute the grounded. And though they shared similarities in some ways, they were also very different. And there's a comment made by Magnus within the novel The First Heretic, where Lorgar is ranting about Guilliman post-Monarchia. That does seemingly imply a not over-fondness on Magnus's part. Lorgar looked back out over the city. As for Guilliman, you have no idea how fine it felt to strike him down. His arrogance is unbelievable. We are blessed with many brothers who would benefit from being humbled once in a while. Magnus smiled. So it's not explicit here, but it does certainly give the impression Magnus puts Guilliman in the bracket of brothers who could use a humbling. that he's a little self-entitled or overconfident. And yes, that is very ironic coming from Magnus. And I wouldn't be surprised if there was a little jealousy there too. But though they weren't the best of friends, I think Guilliman and Magnus could have worked together easily enough, and even held interesting civil debates and conversations between them. They were just different personalities. Magnus probably secretly grated by the fact he finally met a brother that could lecture him as much as he did to them. But moving on, next we have Mortarion. And this was not a particularly good relationship. As we know, Mortarion hated the warp. He hated psychers, sorcery as he saw it. And Magnus personified that. Magnus was bombastic, larger than life. Mortarion was somber, pessimistic, grim. The two of them were chalk and cheese in every way. They could talk, share a conversation and work together when they needed to, but the differences between them were inescapable, and their relationship is probably highlighted best in their greeting each other at Ulanor during the Great Crusade. "Magnus," said the Primarch of the Death Guard by way of a greeting, "I wondered if you would show your face." Mortarion's words were brazen. These were brothers, warrior gods crafted by the Emperor to conquer the galaxy in his name. Like all brothers, they squabbled and vied to attract the attention of their father. But this was distilled anger. "Brother," said Magnus, ignoring Mortarion's words. And I think this greeting sums it up the best. Mortarion would help and save his brother in an emergency, I'm sure, but probably only so he could gloat about it after. Use it as evidence on why psychic power is weak. These two were never going to be firm friends. Their natures simply made it impossible. However, moving on, next we have Horus Lupercal. Now, Magnus loved Horus like virtually everyone else. He tried his best to save him upon Davin, imploring with him desperately to not listen to the lies of chaos. However, despite that, for me, he definitely doesn't appear to be quite as enthralled or in awe of Horus as many of his brothers were. Certainly, he felt no pull or draw to join him out of some sense of loyalty once he fell. "My favoured son returns to me, and I have better things to do than waste my time with the War Master's envoy." Magnus released his grip on the silver thread, and the Argentium circle unravelled at the speed of thought. Lorgar's spirit form faded as it fled across space and time to reunite with his body, and the predatory wraiths bawled at being denied so unique a feast. "Return to Horus," said Magnus. "He may call himself a god, but I place no faith in him." And even back within the Great Crusade, it was the same. And I think that all stemmed from the fact Magnus didn't envy Horus for being that mythical first found Primarch, because he was in contact with the Emperor himself, psychically across the galaxy, for a long time before the Emperor ever physically arrived at Prospero. He fought at his side for nearly 30 years, father and son. Such a bond is unique and not easily relinquished. Truth be told, it is a bond many of my brothers look upon with no small amount of jealousy. But not you. Me. No. I never lost contact with my father. We spoke many times before he ever set foot upon Prospero. That is a bond that none of my brothers can claim. Again, kind of comebacks to Magnus's feelings of self-importance, and so in viewing himself as the best, quite arrogantly, and sharing a unique connection with their father, he wasn't envious of Horus, nor was he awed by him either. He was simply his brother, and he liked and got on with him, respected and loved him, but he wasn't one he was close with, over say his friendship with Perturabo, for example. So it was a good and solid relationship, but I wouldn't go any further than that, and say it was a particularly special one. Moving on, next we have the Horizon, Lorgar. Now, Magnus and Lorgar had a very good friendship, sharing many discussions together seen throughout the Heresy series, feeling a bit like an older brother, younger brother kind of relationship, with Magnus the lecturing elder, and Lorgar the emotional younger. It was Magnus who would visit Lorgar in the aftermath of Monarchia, for example, within the novel First Heretic, where we would get a glimpse of how highly Lorgar rated him. Lorgar's smile fell a notch. Where his brothers were concerned, Magnus was the highest in his affections, not only because he was the first of the family Lorgar had met, but because he was one of the few the Wordbearer's Lord could relate to. The others were, by varying degrees, feral simpletons, cold-hearted instruments of warfare, or vainglorious warlords. Except for Horus, of course. It was impossible to hate Horus. He loved Magnus as one of the few he could speak with, but he never believed himself his brother's equal. And though Magnus doesn't look up to Lorgar, he still very much cared for his brother, and Magnus tried to console him after Monarchia, get him back on track, so to speak. He didn't do that out of a sense of duty, he did it because he cared about his brother, and he genuinely did. Lorgar fell silent as Magnus came to him, the larger brother gripping the other's robed shoulders. The golden Primarch's lips were trembling. His fingers twitched and shook. "My brother, you are raving," said Magnus. "Look at me." "Peace, Lorgar. Peace. Look at me." So again, this was a good friendship, with Magnus taking the elder, wiser brother type of role, which makes even more sense when we realise Magnus was there when Lorgar was reunited with the Imperium. It was only a relationship that was tarnished after Lorgar's corruption and fall, his persistent efforts to draw Magnus to the Pantheon. Now moving on, next we have the Lord of Drakes, Vulkan. Magnus and Vulkan appear to have had a good relationship. While they maybe weren't the closest of brothers, they were brother Primarchs nonetheless. After Vulkan's death upon Macragge, it was Magnus who visited the salamanders transporting his body, where he would aid them in traversing through the Ruinstorm, ensuring Vulkan returned to Nocturne. And though he claimed to be doing so to see if he still possessed the goodness within him, he could have done anything, anywhere in the galaxy. But he chose to help Vulkan reach home. And that means something. And then of course they had their big reunion within the Fury of Magnus, atop the Golden Throne itself, where the regret at the situation was clear. "Brother," said Vulkan, another single word to the heart, another word that bore great power, but this time said without subterfuge, only the stoic honesty for which Vulkan was known. In times of old, he might have embraced his brother in a clatter of warplates, made some aloof comment on his dull pragmatism, or counselled him to lift his gaze from the forge fire once in a while. But these were not times of old. They were the new days of war and death. What could he say to a brother who thought him a monster? That's a clear regret there, at the relationship lost. A revelation that Magnus would have been comfortable enough, happy enough, to see Vulkan, to hug him. Yes, they were different in nature, and Magnus as ever couldn't have helped his lecturing nature, as teased here, revealing he absolutely did to Vulkan. And in Vulkan's own words within Echoes of Eternity, they were never close. But it was clearly an okay relationship, and Vulkan clearly shows the regret at its loss in this encounter too. I mean, this is Vulkan we're talking about here. You had to be a real douche to not like him, and for him to not like you. But next up, we have Corax. Unfortunately, there's pretty much nothing in regards to Magnus's view of the Raven Lord. But given their very different personalities, and lack of information, we can assume they weren't close at all. There is a reference in A Thousand Suns, implying that Corax opposed the Thousand Suns' use of psychic power as unclean sorcery, along with Rogal Dawn. Many of the legions had been reunited with their sires, and some of them found the notion of our powers hateful. Mortarion was the worst, but Corax and Dawn were not much better. They feared what we could do, and spread lies to anyone who would listen, that we were witches, practicing unclean sorcery. Now, if you know Corax, that behaviour doesn't really sound like him. He's definitely not the kind of person to go around whinging or spreading gossip, even if opposed to something. And it does kind of imply that this was before Magnus was found, when we know Corax was in fact one of the last himself to be reunited with the Emperor. So I think we have to take this reference with a grain of salt. However, it's a good signifier that there was not a particularly good relationship between the legions, and thus the Primarchs. Indeed, for all Corax's distant, isolated nature, he was in fact very open to brothers he trusted and got on with, as seen with Guilliman for example, or when he saved the Space Wolves and found Russ in a coma, when he reunited with Rogal upon Terra. Considering we have none of that with Magnus, I think it speaks for itself. However, last but by no means the least, we have Alfarius. Now, I could have sworn there was a hint or tease from Magnus in the lore somewhere, where he said something that teased he knew there was two twins for the Hydra. However, for the life of me, I can't find it anywhere. So maybe I did imagine it. Alfarius was a Primarch who didn't really foster great relationships with any brothers, save Horus Lupercal, outside Omegon obviously. For the rest, you very rarely if ever see an Alfarius mention, unless it's condemning his way of war. And we pretty much get nothing from Magnus at all, which probably speaks for itself. There's a few Magnus references in Alfarius's Primarch novel, but only in regards to his psychic power and nature. Nothing at all really in terms of a relationship between the two. And so, honestly, I think it's safe to say they were distant at best, and we really have nothing else to go on. So there wasn't much of a relationship between Magnus and Alfarius. But that brings us to the end. Magnus's opinion and relationships with all of the Primarchs, based on what we know. As always everyone, what do you think? Were there any surprises for you there? or any relationships that maybe you thought would be different. As always, drop your thoughts and opinions in the comments below. A huge thank you to all my subscribers, your support truly means a lot to me, it really does. If you're new, please consider subscribing to help the channel grow. And if you enjoyed this particular vid, then why not drop a like on it too. But with that said, I am off, and I'll see you all again real soon.